And we're live. I'm here with AynCath. Ayn, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Caleb. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. This is the first podcast of the new year. New background setup. It's gonna be fun.
New year, new you.
That's right.
You're going to be recorded, and I know you've got big plans. You're going to do like speed up from one podcast every month or two to like. I think you're looking at like at least having something out every week, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to record 3 episodes this weekend, but only upload like one of them. And I'm gonna try to do more live readings. We do this one. Andrew and I are starting How to Counter Threats by Western Civilization from Tom Woods. Mm-hmm. I got some apologetics works I want to start covering. I'm gonna try to do Utopia, and I think Belkov and I are gonna try to live read Scruton's Sexual Desire.
Fantastic.
So it's gonna be fun.
Bulge and I are also going to keep doing Maritain's Degrees of Knowledge. I've been having fun with this. I want to try and do some more things with him.
Oh yeah,
give you some breaks. You don't have to be here for every single thing that we do. Thank
you. And I enjoy your guys' episodes. I don't always understand them, but I try. I keep up. I can do a decent job keeping up enough. If I, it's one of the few times I can't do ×2 speed on a podcast.
I think if we do something else after Degrees of Knowledge, it's going to be someone a little easier for both of us. We can just we'll find some Dr. Seuss or something that we can spend an hour and a half on. And
I got a second mic, so soon I'm going to start doing in-person podcasts. I got a guy from the group chat coming in soon. We're going to do some Natures of Antioch and maybe Maritan's Art and Scholasticism in person.
You're gonna have to start flying people out there. Start flying in guests.
I would love to fly in guests. There's so many people I know who are in Florida. I'm like, so Bishop, come over. We'll get some beers and we'll talk about politics for an hour and maybe talk about Napoleon. It'd be great.
You mentioned how the Catholic Church created Western civilization. Tom Woods is in like northern Florida, right? He's
only like an hour away. I'm actually gonna DM him later and try to get him on for a single episode. He had a great tweet earlier about he did an episode on Pope Benedict's death, and someone commented some like super cringe video saying Catholics were pagans. And he just said, I would rather worship the sun than be a Protestant, so no thank you. And I'm like, I need to have Wood just do a whole Catholic episode, because I think when he was kind of doing his podcast and stuff, it wasn't a lot of like, you really couldn't hate on Protestants, Mm-hmm. And nowadays you can kind of say a lot more like, I mean, at least in our circles, you could say a lot more stuff about Protestants not really burning bridges. And so I would love to get him on to kind of do, because he's a historian. Who's got great. He has great things to say about Martin Luther.
It would be fantastic.
So I'm going to try to get him on.
Relevant for our topic today, all the best libertarian thinkers end up being Catholic for whatever reason. So
yes, Woods, Rockwell, Leddihn. And I got to say, every time I prefer to cast when it comes to politics, because some of the politics involves human nature. If it's not from a Catholic guy, I'm very hesitant to take it on its word. Because they often don't account for like man's fallen nature, but Leddihn does account for that in a lot of his stuff. Like he does account for like man's fallen nature, which I think makes him a much more valuable thinker than someone who might have more works and might cover more topics, but doesn't account for that.
Absolutely.
Let me share the screen and we'll hop into it. But actually, before we hop into it, what's this share screen button again? I haven't been using StreamYard forever. I forgot what all the buttons were.
I had to host one time and I panicked when I was with Bulge because I have no idea how to do anything. I didn't know how to do intro, didn't know how to share screens. We need your technical prowess if nothing else.
So Erik von Kuehnelt-Leddihn, how do you say his name, was a 20th century humanities professor. I think he married a duchess. He is a Austrian. Kind of like philosophy, literature, economics. He kind of covers a wide breadth of topics, and you really read it. When we covered monarchy and war, and it was this historical point after historical point, and this one he kind of gets more philosophical. He really had a wide breadth of knowledge. He spoke Japanese in like the 1940s.
He was very much a Renaissance man. Like it was sort of one of the last of an era of just these very classically educated, brilliant Austrian thinkers.
Yeah. There's something about those 20th century thinkers, man, especially from Austria. Like Mises, I was reading his book, Syrian History. He has like entire chapters on Thomism's natural law.
It's the breadth of knowledge that was just sort of commonplace among certainly like, these are elite intellectuals, but like, if you had a PhD, like, of course you've read everyone ever. And that hasn't been the case for several generations, and it much to the detriment of modern intellectuals, where they don't actually know anything.
Oh yeah, no, it's a weird statement. Like, you mean modern intellectuals like, oh, it's not my field, so I can't talk about it. It means it's like, here's why Thomas Aquinas and natural law was actually wrong. And I'm like, you're an economist, dude. You're wrong on this topic, but at least you're covering it, you know. Like, I respect the fact that you know it's not your field, but you're still going to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
But so it's going to read the preface, and then we're going to read like the first chapter. It's not going to be a long episode because it's a big book. I'll probably cut chapters up later. I'll read it first, and then if you have anything you want to say, just kind of jump in and comment, and we'll go from there.
Sure. I'm just before we get into the text, I do want to sort of mention. I think this was, at least the version I was looking at, was dated 1952 or something like that. And I think a lot of the things that I don't know if we'll get into too much tonight, but as he starts getting into, so it's liberty or equality, the challenge of our time is the full title, and I think really sort of. And some of these ideas are very old, but very much gets ahead of somebody like Hoppe, who's writing 40, 50 years later in terms of, okay, what's the tendencies of democracy and what it can actually do. So it's really a man ahead of his time in a lot of ways, as far as, I think, would you call him a classical liberal of the alt-right?
Yeah.
Or of the far right?
Yeah. Now, I think this was a book that Curtis Yarvin read, A Democracy Got to Fail, and realized anarchy couldn't work. And he read this book, and that's kind of what got him out of libertarianism, was Leddihn and Carlyle, were the two guys that kind of took him out of libertarianism. So it's influenced a lot of, I mean, even the term, like Leddihn called himself an arts liberal of the extreme right. Nick Land called himself that one time. So he's very influential in like the main thinkers of the Dark Enlightenment. So it's someone who's like been that influential and not really covered in depths. Mm-hmm. So I think this will be a lot of fun. Preface. Not without inner emotion and certain feelings of hesitancy am I offering these pages to the English-speaking public. The emotion is due to the fact that I lived for over 10 years on the hospitable soil of the United States of America, the native land of my second sire, which to me is my second home. The hesitancy, on the other hand, is a result from the grim foreboding that this volume would be the cause of several misunderstandings and a number of cases of downright resentment. Yet, his Leon Bloy, I think I say his name, has insisted it is later than we think, and the time for flattery, self-delusion, and cheap optimism is over. There we go. An involved situation, a complicated problem, a complex issue cannot be dealt with within a few pages or in a simple way. This task has taxed this mental prowess and the physical energies of more than one person. He also had to be assisted with an editor with a greater mastery of the English language than his own. Of course, as far as material, the facts and the views are concerned, these are entirely the author's responsibility. The reader might conceivably ask himself why this book was written and published on. I lost my spot again. But before we get into it, I'm going to zoom in a bit to make it easier. Okay. Sorry, the first live reading is going to be a little bit of bugs to work out before we get in catch the stride. The reader might conceivably ask himself why this book was written and published in this particular situation and at this particular time. Another edition, a German translation, will be published soon in Switzerland. But the author, an Austrian, he will never forget his American decade and his years in Britain, believes that directly, as well as indirectly, he has dealt with the problems which not only lie at the core of this particular internal crisis, which darkens the horizons of the Occident. Do you know that word?
Occident, I think it's how it's pronounced. I don't think I've ever heard it said, only read, but it's the West, essentially.
Okay, I've never seen that word before. Occident's future, but also the very substance of the great and fatal misunderstanding between the continent and the English-speaking nations. The catastrophic. I want to scroll down. The catastrophic lack of comprehension of the rather opaque world east of the
Calais, I think it's
Calais?
French city. I think my French pronunciation is always terrible. I think it's Calais.
Calais, aggravated by confusion about technical terms, is largely responsible to the great disappointment America and Britain have also suffered after each major war won for their ideas. Each triumph for democracy has ended on the continent with a frightening setback for the cause of liberty. The years 1917, 1918, 1922, 1933, and 1938 were insane defeats for the cause of freedom. The Second World War resulted in military victory and political defeat. I like that.
Yeah,
That's a
but
good line.
I was gonna highlight that because I think that sums up so much of a lot of the history, a lot of modernity. Is sort of these sort of Pyrrhic victories where the goal you're fighting in the name of, despite the victory on the battlefield, ends up losing pretty utterly. Like the slogans of really both world wars for the winning side were not the slogans that carried the day, and much to our detriment, as he gets into in some detail.
Absolutely. In order to help the Englishmen and the Americans to distinguish more clearly between the forces of light and forces of darkness, the material for this book has been collected, arranged, and annotated. It is our fervent hope that we have not altogether failed in this endeavor. Kuehnelt-Leddihn, Lands, Tyrol, June 28th, 1951.
I looked into it briefly. So he's writing from Lanz in Tyrol, and this is in outside Innsbruck in Western Austria. And it's if I haven't been in Lanz, I've been very close to it, but it's literally the most picturesque, beautiful alpine part of the world you can imagine. Like Innsbruck is like at the foot of the or in the sort of middle of the Austrian Alps, and Lanz, I think, even now has a population of like 300 people.
Wow.
So you can just imagine him just like, chilling out in the next to the probably cow fields, next to giant mountains springing up. And it's just, yeah, just to try and paint a picture a little bit of it, because Tyrol is for my money some of the most beautiful land in the entire world.
And that's you said that was in Austria?
Yeah. So, and Tyrol is South Tyrol is actually now Italy. That's one of those places that after World War One, the Italians were like, yeah, of course this has always been Italian and not Austrian, and so everyone still speaks German there, like to this day in South Tyrol, but very Austrian.
As an American who's never left America, Europe's where the lines are drawn on the map and what language people speak in what area, it's always been odd to me. It's a very peculiar situation.
South Tyrol is the strangest experience in the world, because again, you're up in the mountains anyways. So there's like the border there has always been ill defined, just because you didn't have no one's really trying to walk across the border when you're at 6,000 feet or whatever up. But literally, like you're now in Italy. Some of the official signage, like street signs and stuff, some of it changes into Italian. But for the most part, it's still all in German. Everyone speaks German. The food is all German. It's
odd.
But this is where he's writing in the 50s, is out in the really middle of nowhere Alps in Austria.
It sounds beautiful, because I was listening to Last Night of Liberalism from Huysman on biography of Mises. Mm-hmm. And the way he describes, like, apparently the amount of like coffee shops and pubs and all the pubs and coffee shops have magazines everywhere for like science and philosophy magazines. I'm like, man, imagine being in Austria in that time period, like right before World War I kind of thing, where everyone was super smart, educated, and there were pubs and coffee shops, magazines, people were reading these magazines and just kind of engaging in these kind of intellectual conversations in public with strangers.
It's insane. Like, it's sort of a forgotten period of intellectual history, because everyone, if you go back far enough, all these other sort of centers were the sort of center of intellectual growth in Europe. Paris has its heyday, Rome certainly, Florence, all these other places. Going into the 20th century, like, everything was happening in Vienna. There's a reason it's called the Austrian School. There was a reason where Austro Thomism is. That's where they all were. I was seeing a thing today that like all these huge political figures and Freud and Trotsky, and like they were all within like 3 square blocks of one another in Vienna in the 19 teens. Just everything intellectual was happening in Austria. And then World War I happens, and they're all displaced or dead within 4 years.
If you want to hear about how bad World War I was, I recommend you go back and listen to our live readings of Leddihn's Monarchy and War. He covers that well. A little self-plug there. And another Leddihn plug. 2 for 2, baby. Let's go.
Absolutely. You want me to start into chapter 1?
Go right ahead.
Sure. Okay. Chapter 1, definitions and basic principles. This book is an essay in the narrowest sense of the term, an effort to throw some light on certain phases and aspects of the century-old struggle between the principles of freedom and those of equality, between the ideologies of liberalism and of democracy, in their classic sense, of course. It is obvious that this study cannot be exhaustive. Nevertheless, the subjects of our analysis have not been chosen at random, but have been selected for special reasons. Before divining our terms, we think it important to show our hand and to declare our philosophical baggage. it is obvious that any writer trying to analyze political or sociological phenomena critically and methodically will be motivated by a more or less coherent system of philosophy.
I love that point, by the way. I really, like, when I first read this, I wasn't really impressed with the fact that he like declares his philosophical baggage, when so many books nowadays, like, you read like things like Suicide of the West by Burnham, you don't really know what he thinks, you know what he thinks through the book, but you don't know his starting points, you know. Mm-hmm. I really appreciate it when a author or thinker decides to declare their baggage, so you kind of know when they, like, he says he's a Thomist, so I know when he uses certain words, I know what he kind of means by that, you know. Mm-hmm. And it's I was Hopper would say he's a Kantian, because it would make it easier for me to understand him sometimes.
Right. It's a point that sort of has come back in recent years. Is there was I think this fiction for the longest time that you could have these kinds of studies and have the person doing them be philosophically or politically neutral, as they could try and do it in a neutral approach. And one, I don't think it works, and two, it ends up being dishonest a lot of the time. So the fact that he's able to listen, there's like, yep, I'm Catholic, I'm a Thomist. Here's what Thomism is. Here's what it does. This is the perspective I'm going to have. His description of Thomism. He is like she said, he's showing his hand. He's putting everything on the table and saying, "This is what you're going to get."
And I love. We'll see in a minute, but I love his description of Thomism. And I mean, when I did Year Zero with Tommy Salmons, I basically quoted his. I had to explain what Thomism was to the guy, and I quoted Leddihn here, because he has a great point about what Thomism is, and we'll get to that in a minute when you continue reading. Mm-hmm.
And another quick self-plug was me and Bolga have been doing, like I said, Maritain's Degrees of Knowledge. Just goes into some of the details of what Thomism is, and it's the philosophy. Like Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy is the way to think about the world. As far as I'm very much showing my hand. But there is a clarity to it that's fantastic.
Was Maritain considered a neo-Thomist or a regular Thomist? Because I've seen some people refer to him as a neo-Thomist, but I read people who are like Kreeft calls him a Thomist, and Bishop Barron called him a Thomist. But I've seen some people who don't really like him call him a neo-Thomist. I don't really know what neo-Thomism is.
Yeah, so I haven't read a lot of people that are really identified as neo-Thomists. I mean, it is the sort of people that would call themselves Thomists in the 20th century. My impression of Maritain is he's very much a classical Thomist. Neo-Thomists, I think, sort of have either not changed things, but they've tried to modernize in ways that not all Thomists would agree with. So I think Maritain, I don't know if he would describe himself that way, but from everything I've read, he's very much a Thomist, and there's not a lot of neo to his Thomism. Like it is straight out of the Summa for the most part.
Yeah. Where are we at?
Okay, since the present author is a Catholic, his philosophy has an intimate relationship with the theology of his church, a relationship which can best be defined as coordination. The principle that philosophy is the handmaid of theology has for him only a personal but not an intellectual meaning. Although his philosophy is predominantly Thomistic, he is also deeply influenced by a theistic existentialism and by certain cognitions of the phenomenological school. The Catholic reader who is curious as to the reasons which prompt him to deviate from neo-Thomism, today so strongly dominating the philosophical scene in Catholic North America, is invited to peruse the note on the subject on pages 146 to 164 to 167. And I will say that he mentions neo-Thomism. I think whatever movement it was really sort of petered out it existed in the 20th century and kind of died. Again, mostly I think it was an American phenomenon in Catholicism, and I think tried to blend some American sensibility into Thomism. I don't know if there's a lot of that tradition that's alive today. I think if there's been much of a Thomistic revival, don't know what phase it was, how he would refer to himself, but I think most of the sort of modern Thomists are very much Thomists and don't have a lot of connection to the neo-Thomistic. I've
heard him described as a analytical Thomist. Mm-hmm. That's the only thing I've heard him like. Not when people say the Thomist, I always say like analytical Thomism. I don't really see much of a distinction between analytical, whatever that it means, and when I read Thomas Aquinas,
Sure. And it might just be to distinguish it from neo-Thomism.
Yeah.
The non-Catholic reader will not, we hope, be discouraged by the admission just made. We want to assure him that Thomism, the basis of our philosophy, is not a strange esoteric creed full of mysterious illusions. It is, on the contrary, a philosophy characterized by the utmost respect for human reason and one which strives towards objective reality. It is a philosophy of horse sense, with no patience for solipsism, the denial of sensory apperception, and the rejection of the simple laws of logic. Its realism will insist that if statement A is correct and statement B contradicts A, the latter must be considered to be false. There is nothing magical or mysterious with the tenets of Thomism insofar as they underlie the philosophy of these pages. They represent common sense.
Great way to say, he describes Thomism really well in like less than a paragraph. It's kind of like, it's common sense.
Considering that Maritain takes a chapter of his very dense book to go over what he calls critical realism, which is sort of his it's his application of Thomism to epistemology, and it's 70 dense pages, as your viewers will see hopefully in a couple of weeks here when Bulge and I get around to it. But then you can't say much more clearly than is done here. Is it really is? It's about it's realism. It's about objective reality, and it's what you derive from it. This might have also been Maritain. I'm not sure, but I know at some point someone was talking about Thomism, and says very clearly that St. Thomas would never have considered himself a Thomist. He would not have considered what he was doing realism. Right? Is you only sort of make these realizations like when you come up with some other philosophy or metaphysics that's just clearly wrong, to differentiate, you say, okay, no, we're not doing that. We're doing realism. But for St. Thomas, it was very much, I'm thinking about the world. I'm doing proper philosophy. There are no axioms. There is no like, well, this is my worldview. It's like, no, this is what common sense tells us and what we can derive from it through reason. Mm-hmm. As opposed to a lot of modern philosophers that, well, if we consider X axiom to be true, or if we take this stance, and it becomes very subjective. Thomism is very much about objective reality. This is the things we know to be true. If St. Thomas said it and it was based on logic, it is true because it's based on objective reality.
Then want to see a good example of that. EWTN had a great little series called Saints versus Scoundrels, where they would have actors in costumes playing different characters. And they did one of St. Thomas and Rene Descartes. And Descartes opens this bit about, we can't know if we're like ever awake. And before he gave me finish the sentence, Thomas smacks his fist on the table and goes, but what about the senses? Laws begins with the senses. And this kind of like cuts him off right there in the beginning. Doesn't even let go. It's a very that's what was entertaining as hell. They had Flannery O'Connor pull a gun and try to shoot Ayn Rand.
Probably deserved it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ayn Rand would have been a good Catholic if she'd had Flannery O'Connor that a shooter every moment of her life.
Yeah.
Like we still need to do Good Man is Hard to Find at some point. We need to do a book review of Flannery O'Connor regardless. Okay, we're getting in the weeds. Sorry for all the tangents. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. At the same time, we're deeply concerned about the psychological reactions of man, either as a person or as an individual lost in a crowd, and about myths and superstitions. Yet we will naturally subordinate psychology to philosophy and feelings, emotions, and affections to objective reality without forgetting the existence of the former.
Love that line.
That's very good.
It's very good.
And I think when we and he gets into it a little bit more later. I don't want to step on our own toes too much, but it is something that's very easy to forget is that man is not perfectly rational. He will make mistakes. He will have errors in judgment. He will do not all those things are evil, morally evil. Sometimes you can just be wrong. Sometimes you can be motivated by psychology or not get things properly. Yeah. Especially he talks about the psychological reactions of an individual lost in the crowd. Right, the madness of crowds is a real thing, and it's not. Mm-hmm. It is not because of poor philosophy that these things can happen.
Yeah.
When we talk about freedom and equality, we must realize that we are faced here, for all practical purposes, by relative, not by absolute terms, by trends and tendencies rather than by unalloyed abstractions. Freedom in this study means the greatest amount of self-determination which in a given situation is feasible, reasonable, and possible. As a means to safeguarding man's happiness and protecting his personality, it is an intermediary end and thus forms part of the common good. It is obvious that under these circumstances, it cannot be brutally sacrificed to the demands of absolute efficiency, nor to efforts towards a maximum of material welfare. Man does not live by bread alone. Here, as in some other basic matters, most readers will probably admit that they see with us eye to eye because, although not belonging to the church, they are nevertheless adherents and beneficiaries of the Hebrew-Greek Christian tradition, which is something approaching a common denominator. And I'll say, this chapter was, what was it called? Definitions and Basic Principles. I do like that he takes some time and says, okay, there's some terms that especially, and I think it's gotten worse since he's writing, are very loaded with a lot of meaning that doesn't properly belong to them. and wants to take the time and the effort to say, okay, when I say freedom, this is what I mean. When I say equality, this is what I mean. When I say democracy, this is what I mean.
Yes.
Because there is so much obfuscation, and again, it's pressing in a lot of ways because it's so much worse now than it was even then. But it was happening then already. Is this, and I hate to use the word Orwellian, but Orwellian double speak. That you've got a word that you say, okay, I'm meaning this, but I'm really meaning this, and this, and the sort of Mott and Baileys that can come from it. And he is, and I appreciate that he's going back to very classical definitions.
Yeah, like it may be a boomer point, but the Democrats and the Republicans both talk about freedom, and it's like what you both of you mean wildly different things, and both of you are kind of wrong.
Exactly.
So I'm really appreciative of him. Like again, Leddihn is incredible, and he might be one of the best of like the classical trained thinkers. When it comes to like the classically trained people who went to school in the 20th century and kind of knew a little bit of everything. Especially being a guy who was a professor of humanities. Humanities already kind of covers a little bit of everything. Sure. So to be the guy who knows a little bit of everything, teaches a little bit of everything, at a time when everyone knew everything, you had to be really good at everything. And he clearly shows it here when he's talking about Thomism, Christian existentialism, phenomenology, and he does politics. I mean, he is just wide range of knowledge.
Absolutely. I also really like the point that he makes here. He says, as a means to safeguarding man's happiness and protecting his personality is an intermediary end. And I think this is a very, what I would call sort of Catholic libertarian point, is that what you'll sort of hear a lot from a sort of political science perspective from libertarians or from libertarian adjacent people is that freedom is the goal. It's okay, how do we get the most freedom? And he here recognizes very properly that freedom is an intermediary end. Freedom. You use freedom to safeguard happiness and protect personality. It is not a final end. Right? Yeah. We have a greater final end in the common good and knowledge of God and our own, trying to protect ourselves morally. That freedom is a means to that end. That it is intermediary and it is not the end all be all. Which is a point that I think is missed very often or ignored or disagreed with by a lot of libertarian kind of thinkers. Yeah, they view liberty as the end goal and not as the means to an end. Right. It's like I remember. You read some anarchist philosophers like Woods and Rockwell and stuff. They talk about how you need liberty so we can see these greater goods. And you read some people like some Rothbard works, people like Ace, and they think liberty is the goal. Liberty like this is like Matt Erickson, King Perry had a great point. Like liberty to do what? No one really answered this question, and I'm like, that's a good question. Mm-hmm. And of course, the answer would be liberty to do good, and liberty to seek capital G good. Yes. Liberty itself is not a good. Liberty is maybe the best way to achieve said goods. It might be other ways. And he has a point later where he says the liberal picks whatever achieves the most freedom for good, and that means a military dictatorship, or if that means a open democracy, or it means anarchy. Whoever points to that good, that's what the guy with liberals would pick. And I'm like, that's a good kind of Machiavellian way to you have your goal and you have your Machiavellian way of like picking what's best for that scenario. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see. When we speak about equality, we do not refer to equity, which is justice. Even so, Christian equality is not something mechanical, but merely subjection under the same law. In other words, isonomy. Yet to the Christian, two newly born babes are spiritually equal, but their physical and intellectual qualities, the latter, of course, in potency, are from the moment of conception unequal. We shall not go into the psychological reasons for the egalitarian and identitarian tendencies of our age, which we have dealt with elsewhere. It suffices to say that the artificial establishment of equality is as little compatible with liberty as the enforcement of unjust laws of discrimination. It is obviously just to discriminate within limits between the innocent and the criminal, the adult and the infant, the combatant and the civilian, and so on. Whereas greed, pride, and arrogance are at the base of unjust discrimination, the driving motor of the egalitarian and identitarian trends is envy, jealousy, and fear. Nature, i.e. the absence of human intervention, is anything but egalitarian. Another example, what he does it, he says the word of quotation marks, parentheses, description of it. Because, who was it? Like when Paulia described nature, it was, how to put it? I remember I was reading it the other week, and the way he was describing nature was really like upsetting. Mhm.
And so many people just describe mates to it. They describe it as what is ever, I put this, not what is natural, like the absence of human intervention, but in whatever is the, I'm trying to remember it, but I cannot remember the exact voice he argued it.
Sure.
But,
And
I'll put it in the description. I remember it later.
Sure. And it's another one of those words that gets very different meanings depending on who says it. Like if you were Rousseau talking about nature, you mean something very, very different. You know, you can have man in a state of nature versus, you know, civilized man or whatever. You know, here he's talking about things that are completely absent human intervention. In the metaphysical sense, you can be talking about natural things versus supernatural things, in which case, you know, all human activity is natural, in so much as it's not supernatural. So you appreciate that he's saying exactly what he means, especially with these words that get confused a lot. Yeah. It is a little regrettable when he talks about equity at the beginning of this paragraph and says it refers to justice. And equity is a word that has been so completely co-opted and taken over and perverted to its meaning having nothing to do with what it originally was. Yeah. If he was writing now, he would have to have a whole paragraph saying what he means by equity and with footnotes about how whatever because I don't think literally the word equity is never used in a proper sense of being justice. Yeah, of course, justice is also probably not used.
Legitimately have, whenever someone says equity, I legitimately have no idea what that word means anymore. I just no clue. It gets half the time I read equity in a sentence, I always think they meant to say equality. Because I have no basis for how anyone defines that word anymore.
So I think I've been reading a lot of James Lindsay's work recently. I know he's not the most popular because he's I think less an atheist, more an agnostic, but he's been very good on sort of attacking a lot of the issues of the woke, as it were. Yeah. I should probably dig it up real quick, but I don't want to waste too much time. I think he has a good definition of what equity means in the modern parlance, but it most certainly is not justice. See,
I think I would actually pay attention to him if he would just write a dictionary.
Oh, he has. He absolutely has. Yeah, so on his, I'll do a plug for him. So his website is New Discourses. He's got a dictionary. I think it's called. There's a part of it called Translations from the Wokish, where it's literally a dictionary for woke terms.
Respect. Okay, I respect that. That's actually useful. Finally, an IDW guy being useful.
Yeah. No. So I don't care for a lot of the other people in that circle, but I think he's very good. All these random plugs for. Okay. Anyways. I think I had another point here. Where were we? Oh, yeah. It's very interesting because he's writing in the 50s and he's sort of ahead of a lot of the people that are coming up. But just in these obvious points that you'll hear even now when people are talking about things like, you know, just discrimination. You know, we do not treat the innocent the same as the criminal. No, we don't treat children the same as we do adults. And again, then this is very Thomistic, I think, and it's you know, these are just objectively true things. It's very hard to argue against them unless you've created a philosophy that isn't based on reality and sort of had tried to work your way backwards to reality from whatever weird precepts you have. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. See, nature, i.e. the absence of human intervention, is anything but egalitarian. If we want to establish a complete plain, we have to blast the mountains away and fill the valleys. Equality thus presupposes the continuous intervention of force, which, as a principle, is opposed to freedom. Liberty and equality are in essence contradictory. I do think this is about the closest he gets to any kind of modern libertarian, not verbiage, sloganing. I think it's a good point, but he makes it well, but very clearly connects that, you know, equality is necessarily the result of intervention. Yeah. Okay. Of all political labels, none have been more frequently misused than the terms liberal and democratic. Yep. A liberal is a man or a woman who is interested in having people enjoy the greatest reasonable amount of liberty, and this regardless of the juridical type of government they are living under. It is true that the affinities between liberty and the various political forms are not identical. It is also true that while some political establishments show marked liberal trends, they harbor nevertheless, through their dialectics, the danger of far-reaching enslavement. The fact remains that the true liberal is not pledged to any specific constitution, but would subordinate his choice to the desire to see himself and his fellow citizens enjoying a maximum of liberty. If he thinks that a monarch would grant greater liberty than a republic, he would choose the former. Under certain circumstances, he might even prefer the actual restrictions of a military dictatorship to the potential evolutions of a democracy. This
reminds me of Machiavelli's point about how he was in the Prince. I think it was the Prince, maybe the Discourses. He wrote how republics are the goal, but not every place is not every location is like morally ready for the responsibilities of a republic, and sometimes you need a dictatorship to break them or build them into the position to actually have a republic. And republics are good, but they are not just because republics are good does not mean they're universally good in every situation.
Right, and as we'll see eventually, I think there's plenty of arguments that even republics are not the ultimate good that it might be claimed to be. And there is very much a cultural aspect, and he doesn't get into this so much here, but there's certainly a cultural aspect where, like, sometimes you need the restrictions of a military dictatorship to maintain a higher standard of liberty.
Yeah, I mean, currently speaking about today's culture and climate, I would say we need a military dictatorship because we need DeSantis kind of step up here and just get the military behind him.
Oh God, yeah.
You're not in Florida. Don't worry about it.
No, they need to expand. Florida manifest destiny.
That's right.
Move north and west with all haste. Okay.
We need a modern day Napoleon just to keep going.
All right. Thus, any liberal accepting Plato's evaluation of democracy, citation to the Republic, would reject this form of government because, according to this philosopher, it is fatally doomed to develop into tyranny. In this whole discussion of liberty, it should never be forgotten that the highest liberty, which is at one and the same time inalienable, is aesthetic liberty. I do love the point that, like, if you read Plato and agree with Plato and you call yourself a liberal, you have to reject democracy. Which, I mean, is absolutely true. Like, it's pretty foolproof logic.
I don't think there was any book besides maybe the Bible and maybe the Prince where it gets us the bad vibes of a republic. Like, I mean, I'll argue with somebody for like an hour or two. He was trying to say that Plato's Republic was communist. I mean, even Ben Shapiro, he said Plato was a communist. And I'm like, I'm sorry, communism's goal is to be classless. Plato's whole thing is about the three distinct classes in the aristocracy. Like, how the fuck is his goal is to have three distinct classes? How the fuck is that classless like communism? Yeah, it's such a now I get so mad. Anyone sees anything authoritarian, they assume it's on the right. They go, "Well, it's communist." I'm like, not all authoritarianism is communist.
There were plenty of authoritarians before they were communists.
Yes,
maybe a couple of good authoritarians. Who knows?
Yeah.
So I don't even I'm so much happier with reading Aristotle, who, as far as I'm concerned, mostly corrected any errors Plato made. Mm-hmm. That I'm not familiar enough with Plato as I should be, like, because I know there's a lot of good there, but I read Aristotle's version of it, or Aristotle's refinement of most of it, and have been very content.
Yeah, I've read more Plato than Aristotle, mainly because I love Socrates. Mm-hmm. I'm his. What was it? The Gorgias on Courage. I think it was Greater Hippias. One everyone's on Courage is one everyone should listen to. Plato is great because Socrates is great, and that's kind of the only reason to read Plato.
Fair enough. As anybody with a real knowledge of Europe might expect, the term liberal in its political sense is of Spanish origin. It appears for the first time after 1812 in the Iberian Peninsula and was soon adopted by the French. Surthy, in the Quarterly Review, wrote in 1816 for the first time about British liberales, and 10 years later we see Scott using the expression libéraux. This term was used for the radical wing of the Whigs, which is not quite identical with the connotation we attribute to this label. In the United States, a liberal has come to mean a person who welcomes change and thus would not be averse to embracing or fostering a totalitarian ideology. Thus, genuine liberals, as for example the late Oswald Garrison Billard, in order to distinguish themselves from communist sympathizers, like to call themselves old-fashioned liberals. On the European continent, the situation was not dissimilar. There, liberals often engaged in a veritable persecution of all those who preferred a different scope of views. Professor Carlton J.H. Hayes very adroitly called them sectarian liberals. I'm reminded here about what classical liberal has sort of been the one that's come into vogue, because liberal has just the word has been taken by even in some cases avowed Marxists.
Yes, I think it was who was it? At one point, I saw Dr. Wizard Wolf call himself like a liberal, like a while back, and I was like, "What? I thought he was a Marxist." It's just, I blame Dave Rubin for calling himself a classical liberal, and I blame all the Jordan Peterson fanboys. Like, I have a friend. You ever talk to a guy and within 5 minutes talking to him, he only watches Jordan Peterson videos?
I think I know the type. Yeah.
Yeah, like Jordan Peterson has some great points, but he should never be your end all be all because he's not as great as you think he is. And I blame him and Dave Rubin for going to whole like what is the classical liberals? And it's like what the fuck do you think that means? Like what does that mean? It's like a great example. Eric Weinstein, the absolute worst of the worst in public intellectual discourses, called himself a classical liberal, and that guy is just the absolute worst. Like he's so boring. It's like we gotta go to Mars. The US is done. We can't fix it. I'm like, well, do you know why the US is bad? There's lots of reasons. Like, well, can he fix them before we leave? Like, no, it's like, well, how are you gonna not let them happen to get on the new place? Well, we'll figure it out then. I'm like, what the fuck are you saying? Stop it.
Right. So I think I appreciate what you're saying. I think you're really sort of acting against your own best interest here. Remember, our goal is to make you the first bishop of Mars, Caleb.
That's right. That was right. I need to become the first bishop of Mars. Can I become patron saint of space travel? And that would be neat, you know.
Well, sainthood will work on that. That's a bigger, longer term goal. I wanted let's get you the bishopric of Mars first.
Come on, Elon, take me to Mars.
Moving on. The philosophical and psychological motives for the liberal position show a great variety. The driving force in a Christian liberalism will always be affection and generosity. Yet we also know of a liberalism derived from a basic philosophical nihilism, which declares that truth is either a mere prejudice, a piece of intellectual arrogance, a sensory fraud, or that it is humanly unattainable outside the reach of the faculty of reason. It is obvious that such a philosophy of despair, which we reject, does not necessarily result in a liberal attitude. It may wind up in its opposite, and the type of its evolution thus depend merely on the personal preference or temperament. I do want to say here, because I think similar to the point that I brought up earlier about how he was noting that liberty is an intermediate end, I think there's a lot of attempts at sort of allyship between these two views of this Christian liberalism where like, hey, we serve truth, we want truth. Liberalism or liberty is a good approach to getting to truth, and the sort of more nihilistic aspect, the more nihilistic liberals. And I think it's hard to work together. I think that is such a fundamental divide in thinking. It's so hard to try and get any kind of cohesive work done because they want liberty for such different reasons.
Yeah. Speaking of liberty and Christianity, I think we might be publishing soon a very long episode in 2 parts that our own Andrew from Popular Liberty did with my friend Jacob Daniel of Biblical Anarchy. They did an episode on Christianity and liberalism, and I think we might be publishing that soon. So that'd be interesting.
I want to look forward to that. I like both their stuff. I need to catch up with Jacob at some point. He needs to get back on in our chats and bug us. I miss those days.
I miss Jacob. He also needs to convert. That's another one. Jacob. If you listen to this, Jacob, by year's end, I'm gonna get you in the Catholic Church. Okay, year's end. I give him silver time limit on this one. I look best in the presser.
We will get to in a moment. We'll get to some notes on trying to coerce conversion, but we'll save that for a moment from now.
Yeah.
There is another possible motive which can be harmonized with the Christian position, namely the conviction that illiberalism is bad strategy. While fully accepting the distinction between truth and untruth, and even acknowledging the tenet that untruth has no intrinsic right or claim for toleration, the strategic liberal will reject coercive measures simply because they do not lead to the desired result. For instance, it has been suggested that the Middle Ages died of a sort of uremic poisoning because of the practical impossibility of an individual seceding from the church. The strongly coercive tendency which crept into the late medieval church, partly as a result of the invitation by the state, took a couple of centuries to subside. Already in 1818, Pius VII found strong words against the coercive principle, and the Code of Canon Law is explicit on the point that nobody, i.e. no adult, can be forced to become a Catholic. It must be admitted that during the Middle Ages, the lower clergy were rather confused on this point. Note the frequent insistence that Jews forcibly baptized were subject to the jurisdiction of the church. Nevertheless, it could only be a question of time until the full impact of Catholic theology could be felt on the problem with force and coercion. Not only did the Catholic teaching of the supremacy of conscience over all visible authority militate against the late medieval policy, but so also did the precepts of charity. Thus, when handing over a person found guilty to the secular authorities, the inquisitors uttered a standard formula asking the state not to subject the culprit to capital punishment. We cast thee out from our ecclesiastical court and give thee over, or rather leave thee to the secular arm and the power of the secular court, efficaciously entreating said secular court that it temper its sentence close to and on this side of the shedding of blood and the peril of death.
I like that. That's good.
So as a reminder, Caleb, don't try and forcibly convert people to Catholicism.
Well,
Pope Pius VII has found strong words against it.
I'll put the sword back in its sheath and we'll wait till later.
Okay. These changes of attitude, on the other hand, have nothing to do with the adamant insistence of the infallibility of the teaching church in dogmatic matters. Today, the possibility of an honest, tragic conflict between conscience and truth is fully admitted. It was bad psychology, not bad philosophy, which imputed bad faith to every heretic or dissenter. And I think this is, I think, a rather beautiful point is that when you find heresies or Protestants or people who are doing things that have objectively bad consequences, there was a time when sort of the assumption was this person is evil, and there is, I think, the fuller truth that there's not a. I don't think it's non-existent, but it is very rarely are there evil wills. Like usually there are wrong intellects, there are wrong minds, wrong ideas, rather than there are genuinely evil will. As people are acting towards what they think is the good, and therefore can be educated, can be corrected, can be admonished. And aren't demons that need to be slain or put down.
This is one of the points of like I was reading like Thomistic stuff on human action, and it's like all human action is ordered towards a perceived good, which is the same thing Mises says about human action. And so it's again, there's very rarely do you see someone who is acting for perceived evil. Even when someone harms themselves or commits suicide, they are doing it in perceived good that they are better off not being here. Mm-hmm. And so it's very rarely do you find someone who is doing evil for the sake of doing evil because they want to do evil.
Right. And even that's a particularly interesting case where you were justified in trying to forcibly stopping this person from killing themselves, but you do that so that you can then try and help them understand that what they're doing is not good. The ultimate goal is to help the person realize that what they're doing is one of the most evil things. One of the most unforgivable things you can possibly do. The good in stopping the suicide isn't stopping the action so they can just not do it. It's stopping the action so you can educate them to why they shouldn't do it. Exactly. Okay. Yeah. In this connection, it must also be borne in mind that true liberalism is hardly compatible with an unlimited capitalism of the Manchester school. Property is also a means of freedom. Since private capitalism tends to concentrate property in fewer and fewer hands, it is, from a genuinely liberal point of view, only a lesser evil in comparison with state capitalism, which we call socialism. For the truly liberal solution of the problem of production, we have to look to other prophets than Smith and Stalin.
Yeah, I like that part, specifically about property also means that here it is. Since private capitalism tends to concentrate power in fewer and fewer hands, power centralizes in the same way. I think Rothbard said in what is government into our money, that when you have competing currencies, it always ends up centralizing the one currency that's better than the rest because money is power. And the same way power centralizes, in the same way property centralizes in fewer and fewer hands. It's one of the things I think when libertarians hold up decentralization as a goal, it's like, well, that's only a short-term thing. I don't think you can actually maintain decentralization forever or even really a super long. I don't think you'd maintain it for maybe more than a year or two before it's going to start centralizing slower and slower until it's back to where we started.
Or if not centralizing per se, it's only going to be accumulating, right? Like you have to have some mechanism to say, okay, no matter how much wealth or property or power you accrue, it somehow remains limited in its scope of what it can do. Is somehow that power can't act outside the market. Yeah, which is sort of a fallacy. Unless there is some more powerful body that can limit power in that way, power is going to be able to leak outside of whatever confines you try and put around it.
Nah, man, the people are going to love it so much they just agreed not to do that anymore.
For a large number of people, that could be true, but it isn't. It's not the large number of people that are going to be the issue.
Yeah.
And I think he starts getting into this. I don't know if it's in this chapter or it's in chapter 2, but starts talking about, again, similar to Hoppe. Like you can see a lot of, and based on the chronology, I think a lot of him ends up in Hoppe.
Yeah.
But talks about natural aristocracies and that there is a role for the elite where this power can accumulate and what needs to be done with them and how they should function.
If anyone wants to actually read more on on elites and like that kind of stuff, I work with Plutarch on his how to be a wise leader. He talks about the role of the politician. Like one of the great things about ancient Greece, and the politicians were also kind of with people who had to pay for things. Like if you got into politics, you're also going to be spending your money putting on most of these things you were like trying to get done. Like if you wanted to build, say some politicians in ancient Greece wanted to build a new say what's the one I'm looking for, like Pantheon or something.
Mm-hmm.
They had to pay for it. If they want to put on a fair, they had to pay for it. And so like the mechanism for maintaining making sure the people in power were the ones who had the money to be in power. Also, it makes sure they were the ones who wanted to spend money on the people.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a good like self-correcting mechanism, having the partisans pay for it themselves.
And this is, I think, Kuehnelt-Leddihn makes this point in Monarchy and War that wars were financed personally by the monarch, and so you didn't casualties were incredibly costly. You didn't want you'd rather have the army sort of maneuver and surrender very quickly so that you didn't have these huge body counts that cost a lot of money if you were paying for it. Yeah. Once you have conscription, once you have a democracy where you can just you have cannon fodder, that you no longer bear that cost anymore.
Yeah.
The terms democracy and democratic are political. Democracy implies power, rule of the people. The various sociological and social misuses of these expressions do not interest us here. We have, for example, to place a label like the democratic way of life in that category. Mere affection for the lower classes is not democracy, but demophily. The reader is thus solemnly warned that we are dealing with a political concept only. And again, this is one of those things that's sort of gone out of control, talking about the democratic way of life, or talking about, liberal when we're doing nation building, wherever, and we talk about, a modern democracy. Democracy has nothing to do with it. It is very much about an ideology or a sociological position, and has very little to do with what democracy actually means. I appreciate that when he says democracy, he means democracy.
Yes, I gotta say, we talked about it earlier, but I'm gonna say it again. I love how precise he is being with all his words.
I mean, who would ever devote a chapter to the definitions of the words they're using? But it's so perfect, and it's not just. What I appreciate is that yes, it's a chapter on definitions and how he's using terms, but it's not as dry as it could be. Like it doesn't feel like we're reading a dictionary. Like he is going into some detail. He's giving context. It's leading the way towards what he's going to say. Yeah. While he's just taking the time to define his terms very well. So I think he writes well. I know English is probably like his sixth or seventh language, and I know he had an editor, but it works very well. And I can't imagine that it's reading Maritain, you say, okay, this probably works better in the original French. I don't get the feeling reading Kuehnelt-Leddihn that this would really be better if we were reading it in German. Like this, he writes well in English. And again, you were saying, I think this was before we started, but you were saying he spoke Japanese. Like he spoke, wrote, and was fluent in tons of languages.
Yeah. Yeah, I need someone who listening to this to Photoshop Erik von Kuehnelt-Leddihn in a Komodo holding an animal body pillow. I need that photo. I need to be my profile pic for a month. I'm going to go as the Austrian weeb.
Oh, I love it.
I need someone to make that for me.
Too perfect.
Oh, yeah.
There is a classic concept of democracy which lasted with minor variations from 500 BC until the middle of the last century. Some people still cling to the classic sense of the term because it alone has a modicum of conciseness and clearness. Plato, Aristotle, St. Thomas, St. Robert Bellarmine, Father Mariana, Society of Jesus, Alexander Hamilton, Marshall, Madison, Governor Morris, Fustel de Colliers, all vaguely agreed on the content of the term democracy. There does seem to have been among some of the American founding fathers a tendency to identify democracy rigorously with one of its manifestations, direct democracy, a limitation of the term for which Rousseau might have to be held responsible. This is evident when we read Madison's definition of democracy in the Federalist, numbers 10 and 14, or John Adams' attack on democracy in his defense of the Constitution of the United States of America. Yet the case of John Adams is not entirely clear. A more complete perusal of his writings gives evidence of a strong opposition to the egalitarian principle And we also know that he had qualms of conscience for having abetted the American Revolution insofar as it was the forerunner of the French Revolution and its sanguinary aftermath. Alexander Hamilton vehemently criticized democracy in his speeches on June 21st, 1788, on the Compromise of the Constitution, and in the Federal Convention on June 26, 1787. In fact, Governor Morris ascribed Hamilton's opposition to republicanism to his confusion of republicanism with democracy. There should be no doubt whatever that the vast majority of the Founding Fathers not only detested and opposed direct democracy, but as strict Republicans, were also deeply critical of most of the principles of indirect democracy. And here we have the introduction of the "We live in a republic, not a democracy" crowd, and their autistic streaking.
I've always hated that line. Like someone's like, "We live in a republic, not a democracy." I'm like, a republic is a democracy in a cheap dress, it's a cheap lipstick and a $12 dress. It is a prostitute. That's what it is. It's ridiculous.
And it is quite literally a democracy, even if it's not a direct democracy. Thomas Jefferson is often glibly called a Democrat and the founder of Jeffersonian democracy, as opposed to Jacksonian democracy. Yet when we analyze the contents of democracy in its direct as well as its indirect form, we must come to the conclusion that his stand was not democratic at all. Dr. Mortimer Adler quite rightly rejects Jefferson as a Democrat and insists that the dawn of American democracy really begins with Jackson. What then are the precepts of democracy? It has only two postulates: legal and political equality, franchise for all, and self-government based on the rule of the majority of equals. Depending on the manner of exercise of this self-government by the whole populace or by representatives, we speak of direct or indirect democracy. It is also obvious that the representatives in an indirect democracy have the duty of repeating the views of the electorate. In the opposite case, we have a republic rather than democracy. The respective minorities, moreover, the freedom of speech, the limitations imposed upon the rule of majorities, have nothing to do with democracy as such. These are liberal tenets. They may or may not be present in a democracy. Jefferson actually was an agrarian romantic who dreamt of a republic governed by an elite of character and intellect and based on the support of a free yeomanry. This is evident when he writes in a letter to John Adams, dated October 28, 1814, "The natural aristocracy I consider as the most precious gift of nature for the instruction, the trusts, and government of society. And indeed, it would have been inconsistent in creation to have formed men for the social state and not to have provided virtue and wisdom enough to manage the concerns of society. May we not even say that form of government is the best, which provides most effectually for a pure selection of these natural aristoi into the offices of government."
I gotta say, Thomas Jefferson had some. Like, I've read some of his letters; they are almost off this bangers. Like, he had some great letters. He write.
Yeah, no, he's, and I think we'll get into a little more in a second here because he's a very complicated thinker, and I think I was listening to some Tom Woods thing recently where he was talking about Jefferson, and he really is on both sides of what we would call a lot of modern arguments, or arguments of the day. Yeah, but is just a very clear thinker and very clear writer, and expresses things very well.
I saw his personal library in DC, and he had an insane amount of books, like all of Plato, Aristotle, like Sir Thomas More. One of my favorite letters he had a point like, does the world not belong to the living? How can we create a system from now that the dead have bearing over the living later? Mm-hmm. Like, I think that's a good question. It's kind of like, what belongs to the living? Does the living have a right to recreate? Like, how far can the living claim to the world go into recreating everything they see before them, and how much sway the traditions of the past have on the next generation? Like, It's a good question to ask. He doesn't answer it. He got to ask it and moves on to personal questions about the guy he's talking to. But
no, I think what his idea is also like every law should be repealed after like 19. Like basically every generation, all the laws should go away so people can make new ones.
We've gone for almost an hour. Let's finish up this page, and then we'll have to come back to finish another part later, because it's almost an hour. We're not even like we're barely 8 pages in, and we're an hour in.
I'm going too slow. I need to speed read. Sorry.
So good. There's so much to comment on,
Yeah. Okay. So I'll keep going. You tell me when to stop. And in another page of the same letter, he adds, "Everyone by his property or by his satisfactory situation is interested in the support of law and order, and such men may safely and advantageously reserve to themselves wholesome control over their public affairs and a degree of freedom, which in the hands of the canaille of the cities of Europe would be instantly perverted to the demolition and destruction of everything public. His rejection of an urban proletariat was so outspoken that it is difficult to see how he could have been elevated, even temporarily, to the august position of patron saint of the common man. He wrote, for instance, the mobs of great cities add just so much to the support of pure government as swords do to the strength of the human body. I consider the class of artificers as the panderers of vice and the instruments by which the liberties of a country are generally overturned. In his later age, his views mellowed somewhat, but he seems to have opposed female suffrage at all times. His agrarianism never subsided, although it found its most concrete expression in his younger years. In that spirit, he wrote to Madison a letter dated December 20th, 1787. I think that our governments will remain virtuous for many centuries, as long as they are chiefly agricultural, and this will be as long as there are vacant lands in any part of America. When they get piled upon one another, as in the large cities of Europe, they will become corrupt as in Europe.
That is a great quote. It's fantastic.
And quite prescient, I think, too. I mean, it's not until the sort of agrarian age of America ends that we really start seeing serious corruption and the growth of cities. Because I mean, there certainly are still vacant lands here, but so much of it is owned. Like you can't go homestead very many places. You can't go. There is no frontier anymore. This
whole little bit here reminds me of a, for lack of a better word, a no-no book I've been reading lately, from some guy who was in charge of agriculture in some country during World War II. If you know what I'm talking about, you know. If you don't know, you should find out and read it, because it's actually been a really good read.
Well, yeah, so, you might have to do that one solo when you do it for the book club. But
I would love to cover this. I'm reading so many books now. I'm like, I'm never going to be able to cover this one. I can't cover that. How Pete covers Yaki is beyond me.
Fair enough.
I'd be scared to cover Yaki.
Okay. We've got like 3 pages left. Do you just want to try and push through?
Let's try to push through.
Okay, great. Okay. The expressions Democrat and democracy hardly occur in the Monticello edition of Jefferson's works. In a letter addressed to Washington on May 17, 1792, he called himself a Republican Federalist, and in his first inaugural address, he insisted that he was a Federalist and a Republican. When Andrew Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams for the presidency in 1828, he was called by some of his supporters a Democratic Republican, since both candidates used the Republican label. Van Buren prided himself on being a Republican, but the term Democratic was again used by Pierce in 1852. Yet the founder of American democracy undoubtedly remains Andrew Jackson, whose monument in Washington is in front of the White House, surrounded by the statues of 4 European noblemen who fought in America for liberty, but not for equality or majority rule. Taducius Kosciuszko, Baron von Steuben, the Marquis de Lafayette, and the Comte de Rochambeau.
Marquis de Lafayette is one of my favorite historical figures when it comes to like the American Revolution. That dude had so many amazing moments.
The French role in the Revolution is always very fun, very fun.
I mean, at one point, apparently, because he didn't speak any English, and so very little English, and so he would like rally the troops by running at him on a horse and just screaming at him in rapid fire like French, and they had no idea what he was saying, so they kind of just followed him into battle.
Whatever works.
Yeah.
Pulaski and Baron de Kalb have their representations in stone elsewhere. Those who want to avoid confusion and insist on clarity in political thinking by carefully trying to distinguish between liberalism and democracy and between democracy and republicanism are probably fighting a losing battle, lost battle at this point.
Yep.
Most people are not usually aware of the fact that one of the most important differences between the continental and the Anglo-Saxon tradition of representative government has to be found in the important alloy which has been so far the almost inseparable concomitant of the latter, Whiggery, or liberalism in the classic sense. The names and works of the 19th and 20th century thinkers who have carefully distinguished between democracy and liberalism will be found in the next chapter, note 58. But the vast majority of Americans and Englishmen talking about democracy always include the liberal element in their conception of democracy, and this in spite of the fact that democracy and liberalism are concerned with 2 entirely different problems. The former is concerned with the question of who should be vested with ruling authority, while the latter deals with the freedom of the individual regardless of who carries on the government. A democracy can be highly illiberal. The Volstead Act, quite democratically voted for, interfered with the dinner menus of millions of citizens. Fascism, National and International Socialism repeatedly insisted that they were in essence democratic, a claim which must be viewed in a strict philosophical and historical setting, and in this view becomes less hypocritical than observers in the Western Hemisphere are wont to admit. The Soviet use of the democratic label is by no means a shrewd political maneuver of recent years, but a terminology already adopted by Lenin and continued by Stalin throughout the 1920s. If we accept St. Thomas's definition of democracy, De Regime Principium 1.1, we will find that the dictatorship of the proletariat, provided the proletariat forms majority, is more democratic than the American Constitution, in which, in contrast to the sacred books of communism, the word democracy never figures. I think this is an excellent point, and getting into a lot of the subject of matter of the book is that, again, when people say democracy, what they mean is liberal democracy. And liberal democracy, those two words don't necessarily go together. And indeed, as he's going to show, and as Hoppe sort of screamed from the rooftops, really don't properly go together.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we can imagine an absolute ruler, an autocratic emperor, for instance, who is a thoroughgoing liberal, although it is obvious that he cannot be democratic in the political sense. 51% of a nation can establish a totalitarian regime, suppress minorities, and still remain democratic, while an old-fashioned dictator might reserve to himself only a few prerogatives, scrupulously refraining from interfering in the private sphere of the citizens. There is little doubt that the American Congress or the French chambers have a power over their nations which would rouse the envy of a Louis XIV or a George III were they alive today.
I want to say real quick, the first point about 51%, that's 51% can establish a totalitarian regime and suppress minorities to remain democratic. That's a point a lot of anarchists make today. They don't ever really make the flip side point about an old dictator might reserve themselves only a few prerogatives, scrupulously refrain from interfering with private spheres. They never make that flip side point,
Yeah, which is interesting because they'll point out so often like sort of the anarchic nature of, say, something like medieval Europe, where you had, a lot of different principalities and kingdoms and baronies and whatever else that had a pretty, code that had no power over each other. But in each of their individual areas, they were an absolute monarch, but they were very liberal in this sense, is that there wasn't a lot that they did or could do to their citizens. And this is a sort of a lost point, that you can have rulers that have absolute authority or a lot of authority that can't really exercise it in a liberal way for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's a good point.
Yeah, it's great.
Not only prohibition, but also the income tax declaration, selective service, obligatory schooling, the fingerprinting of blameless citizens, permissible blood tests, mask mandates, vaccine mandates. None of these totalitarian measures would even the royal absolutism of the 17th century have dared to introduce. After having established the character of the difference between democracy and liberalism, we would like to give a few hints as to the plan of this book, which consists of selected chapters on this subject, studies and essays which do not cover the whole ground, but represent an effort to throw some light on various aspects of the problem. The first, Democracy and Totalitarianism, The Prophets, deals with the apprehensions of thinkers and observers who lived between 1790 and 1914 and, in true Platonic fashion, feared the rise of totalitarian tyranny as an evolution or dialectic process from the very essence of democracy. We have tried to coordinate their views with those of our contemporaries and thus to offer to the reader a sample of the history of ideas. The second, A Critique of Democracy, which has been previously published in somewhat different form in New Scholasticism, July 1946, deals with the weaknesses and inherent dangers of the democratic doctrine. In this, as well as in the following two following essays, our field of investigation is that of political sciences, and our investigation itself is based on a specific philosophy. The third, Democracy and Monarchy, a study in comparative government, is a continuation of the second, while the fourth, The Political Temper of Catholic Nations, tries to revise the picture as to the inherent liberalism and anarchic tendencies of the Catholic nations, as well as to analyze the probability of democracy becoming a going concern in the larger part of Europe. The fact that only 13% of the European continent is Protestant, and that Catholicism is also the dominant religion in the Western Hemisphere, shows the importance of such research. The next two studies are of historical nature. The fifth, Hus, Luther, and National Socialism, traces the direct influence of Hus on Mussolini, his Italian interpreter, and on the Czech National Socialists of 1897. and also the influence of Hus on Luther and of Luther on the German National Socialists. His last
that's gonna be an exciting one, especially considering we just hopped off of a treat from Maritain and saw Luther's influence of Descartes on Rousseau. I'm very excited to see what he has to say about Luther's influence on German National Socialists.
Same. I think it's a fascinating connect because I'm sure I'm excited to get into the meat of that whenever it happens. I don't know how many of these you want me to come and do, but I'm excited to read as many as I can. I'm still going to be reading along and keeping up with all the live readings for it because it's
wonderful.
Yeah. And I think we mentioned this earlier. This first chapter is probably the shortest one. There's another 200 plus pages, and then 200 pages of notes. I think at the end,
it's a big book,
which we won't need to go into. But yeah, okay. The last contribution tries to clear up a most dangerous misunderstanding. It deals with the historical and intellectual background of the Nazi Party, and we have given it the title "The Rise of the National Socialist Party." It is based on thorough factual documentation. A slightly condensed version has already appeared in the Journal of the History of Ideas, number 9, number 3, June 1948, page 338 to 71. We conclude with a short summary pointing out some conclusions from the facts assembled. We leave it to the reader to draw others. And although at present the dice are heavily loaded, only time will tell whether freedom, equality, or perhaps inequality with a new servitude will prevail.
And that was the first chapter. It was only 11 pages, and we went for an hour and 11 minutes.
we tend to chat too much. We have too many good things to talk about.
But there's so many things to say. I mean, he says like one line, you're like, well, I could talk about that for an hour. Like it's just there's so much to say. He's an incredible thinker. Thank you for coming on. I hope to have you on again soon for more of these live readings or the other podcasts, other book clubs. Go ahead and give your plugs. Where can people find you at?
Sure. So it is at AynCath on Twitter, the Anarcho-Catholic, anarchocatholic.substack.com for the Substack that I, in theory, still write for. I am a contributor for AustroThomism.com. I've been talking for months now about this article that I've been writing. My wife has finally been like, you've been talking about this article on podcast for like 4 months. Just go ahead and finish it. So I'll tell you right now, Caleb, I'm going to finish my article on materialism by the end of the month, and we'll have it up on the AT because I'm really excited to write it. I think it's one of the things I've been more excited to write about, but that'll be up there. Catch me and Caleb and the other AT members, writers, contributors on various book clubs. But yeah, that's me.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for coming on. Again, guys, podcast, subscribe to the podcast, hit the like button, hit the notification bell, share this everywhere. The website is down, and I cannot figure out why or how to get it back up. I will probably just spend my Saturday on tech support with some Indian dude trying to fix it. We have articles from Connor Mortel coming out soon. Hopefully, Louise gets the article about divorce being a simulacrum or something. I'm very excited to get that one. A lot of great podcasts coming out, a lot of big guests. This is going to be a big year. Make sure you subscribe because you don't want to miss any of it. And with that, have a good night.